Prasad, and I'm from the Henry Ford Health System Innovations in Detroit, Michigan. It's really delightful to be here today to talk about this important topic of innovation in legacy cities. And in a lot of ways, this is going to be a continuation of the conversation that was begun a couple of sessions ago, where we had a really good discussion about innovation districts in general. And the team and I, the panelists and I, met over lunch to decide what is it about innovation and legacy cities in particular that we wanted to address, and what are some of the themes from earlier that we wanted to pick up on. So what we've decided is we're going to, of course, introduce ourselves, and we're going to talk about a whole host of things, but we also want to continue our conversation around social inequity, which was begun earlier. We want to touch on maintaining momentum and enthusiasm for the long term, which is especially important in some of the legacy cities that we're all from. And then partnerships. You are seeing a panel who brings very unique perspectives to the table. We have development, philanthropy, policy, and the private sector all represented here. And we will together talk about how do you change the economies of cities that have traditionally been very dependent on manufacturing for their employment base. So we're going to introduce ourselves. Let me begin. I am now working for the Henry Ford Health System in Detroit, Michigan in their innovation program, where we commercialize technologies coming out of the health system itself and push them to market through licensing and business spin-offs. Henry Ford Health System is one of the anchors of the Detroit Innovation District, and we will talk about that a little bit more as we go forward. Prior to this, I was the president of an advisory firm which worked with eds and meds to increase their economic impact. And before that, I was an associate vice president at the University of Pennsylvania, where I helped to implement the West Philadelphia initiatives. Some of you may know that that has become a national model for how universities can really reshape the economy in their surrounding community. So without further ado, let me have the panelists introduce themselves and we'll get started. Benji?
Sure. So my name is Benji Kennedy, and I'm the Deputy Director with the Kresge Foundation. We are based in Detroit, but we work nationally, committed to expanding opportunities in America's cities. We're about approaching $4 billion in assets, make about $140, $150 million in grants and social investments a year across a range of different issues that sort of all aggregate to community revitalization and community development. And I will add that I was born and raised in Dorchester, but it's always wonderful to come out here to the West Coast. San Francisco is beautiful this time of year. I tell you, I do not recognize this district. It is extraordinary what has happened here. I don't even know where I am, honestly.
Good afternoon. I'm Lavea Brachman. I'm the Executive Director of the Greater Ohio Policy Center. We're a statewide policy group, although we think of ourselves as a think and do tank. And so does one of our major funders. We do a lot of research, so we're very data-driven, but we also operationalize some of the key ideas that we think need to drive the transformation of Ohio to the new economy. We were formed to be particularly focused on regenerating growth in our urban areas in Ohio. Ohio is one of the most urban states in the country, though it does have a very strong rural political voice, which is one of the challenges of working in the state. We work in a nonpartisan way, so we've worked very closely with both, I've now been at a Greater Ohio through both the Democratic and Republican administration, and we have extremely good relationships with both the governors and their staff, so we work closely with both. We've chosen three main areas to work in: urban revitalization and neighborhood growth, number one. Number two, transportation and infrastructure change. And the third is regional governance. And in my remarks, I'll get a little bit more into why that's regional governance and regional economic growth, why that's so important. I guess the last thing I'll say, just to set the stage, is we feel that the growth in the millennial generation, that demographic, is a huge opportunity for Ohio and many of the legacy cities, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about that and how that plays into the this innovation theme.
Good afternoon, my name is Dean Amhaus, and I'm with the Water Council in Milwaukee, and we do water. That's our expertise. And it's interesting, I was just saying, is that I go into bathrooms, and I look at what the fixtures are and all that stuff. I haven't been into the women's room at all, but when you think about the companies that we represent, it's the companies that are making things. And the roots of our industry actually go back, in all due respect to our friends in St. Louis, to making beer. And that is the companies that we are engaged with. So these are the companies that make the meters, the filters, the fixtures, the pumps, now the sensors, all of those things that are the technology related to the processing of water, both from a quantity as well as a quality. And one of the things that was a discovery for us, while many of our businesses have been around for 150 years, they weren't seen as water technology companies. They were seen as a measurement company or a heater company in consumer products. And it was about 6 years ago when we turned the picture, did a 90-degree switch on it, and we said, oh my God, they're all dealing with water in some respect. We thought initially there were 50 companies within our Milwaukee region. It ends up that we have 160 companies that are all dealing with water treatment as well. And we also discovered a small little program, which we thought was small, was Great Lakes Water Institute, and it had started out 40 years ago with the Clean Water Act. Became the largest freshwater research facility on the Great Lakes. That is now a school, a full-fledged school of freshwater sciences. And so what we've done is be able to pull together from a cluster industry, academia, utilities, to create a cluster that we're literally reaching out across the entire world. We have created our own, in some ways, innovation district, but it's all focused on water technology. So we've taken over about 100,000 square foot building a year ago that's devoted to water technology companies, large, small, medium, and university researchers. That space has been completely filled up. We are now looking at building number 2, and we're building out an entire water technology park across the street from our building. And about 5 minutes away is the School of Freshwater Science, which opened their own research facility where the basic research goes on, and our area goes on the commercialization. So I'm sort of going to be talking about the influence of the private sector. And when we talk about public-private partnerships, we actually talk about private-public partnerships, and that the private sector has really been the driver of it.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Cathy Belk. I work with Jumpstart in Cleveland. We are a 10-year-old nonprofit. We were born of a crisis. From 1991 to 2003, the major metro area of Cleveland was ranked as one of the 3 worst places to be an entrepreneur in the United States for 12 solid years. And thank you to the amazing philanthropists, civic leaders, and business leaders in our community who took advantage of a crisis to create Jumpstart, where I now work. And the focus of that at the time was to create an entrepreneurial economy by enabling startups to start and flourish. That hadn't happened in Cleveland in a massive way for 100 years. So our initial focus has been in the work that's very familiar, particularly to folks from Boston, providing capital to and support for high-tech, high-growth entrepreneurs. We're also now moving into the space of what we would call gazelle acceleration or scale-ups, working with existing small businesses who also need capital, who also need technical assistance to enable job growth. And in doing so, we're finding many of the same challenges that our startups have. So that's how we're moving. And one other comment, which is that economic inclusion has always been a key part of our work, because as a legacy city, we want to make sure that everybody is able to participate in this new economy.
Thank you. Innovation and the legacy cities, it's a topic that's very near and dear to my heart and to the heart of several of us who are here from Detroit. I know that there's probably like half a dozen of us here from Detroit, so I think that means we're doing something right and people are interested in learning about what that is and being part of it. I grew up in the Detroit area and left after college because of the lack of economic opportunity there. And in my case, I moved to Philadelphia, but most of my friends moved to New York and San Francisco and Boston, and created much depth and breadth of talent in those cities. But through a consulting engagement 5 years ago, I was able to rediscover my hometown and have become a boomerang, which is what we call people who left the Midwest and have now come back because of the greater opportunity there. So my question to the panelists, other than bringing people like me back home, what is the innovation, what is the meaning of the innovation economy? What does that mean to the cities, the employers, the residents who are there? And maybe we'll start with Benji, because he's sitting right next to me.
I thought you gave me softballs.
Softball? Make it harder.
Look, so let me start here. For us, I mean, we're a private foundation. We're a charitable organization. So in a lot of ways, and I've said this for a number of years, I mean, this type of work, supporting the innovation economy, supporting, frankly, economic development, is kind of at the edges of our mission. It's the periphery of our mission. And it's sort of not the traditional space, for philanthropic institutions to play in. So we really have to think about the greater good here. What is the role of the innovation economy and making Detroit a more prosperous and sustainable place going forward for all of its residents. The way I would frame it, and the sort of arguments that we've used internally as we've deployed capital, grant capital into this space, is that this is really about competitiveness for the city. And so I actually define innovation economy probably in a less sophisticated way than many of you. I mean, I just simply think about technology-driven sectors. I think about the sort of leading edge leading edge economic sectors. Research-driven economic value creation. My sense is that any major American city that doesn't have at least a toehold in this new economy, this innovation economy, this technology-driven economy, is a city that is going to be hugely uncompetitive in this century. And if the city is uncompetitive in this century, that has incredible implications for all of its residents, particularly those that are least mobile, right? Those that simply can't leave. And so, for us, the innovation economy is simply one slice of the economy, but it's become an increasingly important slice of the economy in the context of the work we do in Detroit, because it is, the differentiator. It's the differentiator that can make us competitive going forward and will allow us to ensure a prosperous future for the residents of Detroit.
So I agree with Benji. I would probably frame it a little differently. I'm also kind of a boomerang, if you can call it. I live in Columbus. Greater Ohio is, we operate out of Columbus, but we operate statewide. I spent a lot of time here in Boston, product of a couple of the universities in Cambridge here. So I was sitting last 24 hours listening to how innovation was being defined here today. But in Ohio and probably in other places in the Midwest, I would define it much more broadly. And I would say that next economy has a very wide meaning. It can mean startups by immigrants in Dayton. It can mean advanced manufacturing in Akron. It can mean biotech in Cleveland. Really, it's almost anything that is a new frontier of a new idea, because almost anything is moving forward in places that are legacy cities, rather than moving backwards in terms of going back into an old industrial economy. So I would define it very broad range, and I think that those who are looking at investing in any of these types of new economic ventures need to think of it that way. Certainly in evaluating risk, that's not something that we do. I do the policy side of things, so I know that there are sort of a lot of factors involved in evaluating risk of investing in these different kinds of ventures. But there's no, in looking at moving an economy forward in a place like Ohio, you have to build on your assets, and a lot of times that's based in the past, but figuring out what that means for the future.
And I want to build on the notion of building on your assets, and it really gets back to the legacy, is that what we have done is literally go back to 150 years ago, what we were doing, and simply innovate and create something that is our core. And what I'm seeing is that now as we've developed our water technology within our community, now we're starting to see everybody wants to do water technology. Well, you don't really do this at all because you don't have a 150-year-old company that's dealing with the treatment of water. I also think that the notion of innovation is always thought of as high tech, and that depends on who you're talking to, because there is a whole different audience that's out there. And we do high tech, and we have companies that are making a really novel product that's a device that you put on a door handle for a restroom, that when you pull the handle, a new sleeve comes over, a piece of plastic, because what's the biggest cause of disease? Is the bathroom. And very, very novel product. But there's another product that is going to be used in Africa and India, has absolutely zero technology. It is a bucket with a filter that you put dirty water in and it cleans the water. Very, very low tech. But for that area, in terms of somebody who doesn't have any water, extremely innovative and very cost effective because it's something that they can have. So I think that the notion of innovation depends on who you're talking to, and I would just simply go back to is play to a place strength of your legacy, of your roots.
Just one thing to add to all these comments with which I agree, and that is, we would say creating sustainable jobs. That you'll have economic vitality in your community when you create sustainable jobs, and that comes from innovation in existing industries, and new companies.
Argue now, is that what?
Yes, absolutely.
I'll take the innovation is everywhere and innovation can mean anything, like sort of argument, that's fine, but I don't like it. I mean, I think somehow look, sometimes when we talk about the innovation economy or the next economy, the new economy, frankly, there's something implicit in there about rates of return, about ROI, about sort of scalability, and all sorts of things that suggest a kind of extreme return on investment. And I think when you start suggesting to people who are, frankly, to a retail entrepreneur, that they are somehow part of the innovation economy, you're suggesting that there's a sort of prosperity path for them that maybe isn't as steep, or that is steeper than it actually is. So, like, I think you want to kind of, I think it's sort of misleading when we sort of start talking about like, oh, innovation is everywhere, and sort of, every new business is part of the innovation economy, et cetera, et cetera. I think we should be specific about these things. We should call it what it is. And we should know when we're talking about the innovation economy. We should know when we're talking about patentable technologies and patentable ideas and things that offer high rates of return and need a certain type of talent. And we should know when we're not talking about that. And I think that's a sort of an honest thing to do.
Well, and I think again it comes back to how you're going to interpret what is innovation necessarily. And it's a word, and it's the same type of thing that we're hearing tossed around a lot, clusters. And everybody is wanting to do a cluster right now when, in fact, you don't have the core strength of it. And I don't really care what it is necessarily, what you want to call it. The fact is can you deliver a product to somebody who needs a solution? And it can be as low tech and no innovation involved with it. Now there is actually some things that are engaged with it. But if it's something that you can sell, and in fact when we were talking over lunch is, I've heard over the last few days is about angel and venture and all of these different funds. The companies and the entrepreneurs and the small businesses that we're talking to, the biggest thing that they're looking for is who can buy my product. And if we make things instead of necessarily just creating these, elements that are on the web necessarily. And I think that there's a core back to that sustainability jobs is we're looking to try to create things that are going to feed out into the entire community, which goes back to your sort of social enterprise within communities as well.
I think that point well taken about, sort of what innovation means to many investors, but I think if we're trying to look at a systemic change, which is a little bit more where my organization comes from, you have to kind of meet these places where they are to some degree. And, we can probably quibble over the meaning of the term innovation, and maybe, what I'm really talking about is putting the structures in place for a range of kinds of new economic change. But I think the main point is that not every city is going to be a high-tech revolution, and that's okay. But we still need to be looking at where these cities are going to fit in a new economy. I think that there are some very fundamental changes that have taken place since these cities grew up. All of them grew up around particular industries, and those industries have left or they don't exist anymore. So you have to really sort of look at recreating the fabric for these places, and that includes how do you deal with the distressed neighborhoods, what is their economic strength going forward. So that's just sort of a different take on the next economy.
One of the things I think we're talking about is the difference between innovation and entrepreneurship, both of which are extremely important in today's world. So I'm going to ask all of you to sort of expound upon what those differences are, and also on social equity. How do we ensure social equity in our investment strategy as we're investing both in innovation and entrepreneurship? In many of our legacy cities, the workforce, because of the breakdown of the education systems, the workforce perhaps is just unable to participate in the innovation economy as Benji has outlined it, and therefore is sort of stuck in that entrepreneurial economy. How do we invest in both so that all boats rise with the tide?
Those are really big questions. Why don't I just start with the first one, innovation and entrepreneurship. At Jumpstart, obviously, we think about this a lot because we work with entrepreneurs. And I think of it as a T, where innovation is the top bar and entrepreneurship is the longer vertical. And what I mean by that is innovation occurs in many, many places. Large companies, universities, hospital systems, entrepreneurial companies. It's occurring in lots and lots of different organizations, and that's around the creation of new ideas and then taking those new ideas and translating them into technologies. Entrepreneurship, to me, brings in that element of the entrepreneur, the leader, the risk taker, the person who's going to take an idea and translate it into a new business. And that's why I say it goes very deep, whereas innovation goes more broadly, and can occur from all these different sources. In terms of social equity, our belief is that we want to be welcoming. Entrepreneurship can be welcoming, and we want to give visibility and opportunity to everybody. We work very hard on our outreach activities so that everybody who lives in our area can learn what high-impact entrepreneurship looks like, what it feels like. They can learn stories of people who've been successful with it. Lots of people maybe don't see themselves fitting with that. That's not what I do. I'm going to do something different. They opt out on their own. But our job is to make sure that they are able to access the knowledge that would enable them to understand what that means.
I like your interpretation of innovation and entrepreneurship, so I'll just stick with that one. Because within our operations, we have very large international companies that are working on lots of different innovations. They, in some ways, are acting like entrepreneurs, segments of it, but there is things that can happen in government, it can happen in the public sector in all different shapes and forms. The entrepreneur is really the individual or individuals that have a mindset that are willing to take those kind of risks that are real important. I think that the thing that what we're finding within the water technology area, it's a very traditional white male industry. People don't think about going to school and going, oh boy, I'm going to go and work for a sewage plant, and that's not something you think about at all. And what we're trying to do is to be able to get more individuals to start thinking about water as a critical resource and an opportunity that exists. We aren't hearing that from other parts of the world where it's obviously front and center. And I think that's part of the problem for within the United States. We don't have to think about water at all, so it's not a critical need. But as we develop out our community, we're trying to reach out as far as wide as possible.
I'll actually speak to the second question about sort of building a more inclusive, quote-unquote, innovation economy. Because I think it relates to our first bit of conversation. So I think there's one way to make an innovation economy more inclusive, which is to broaden the definition of innovation. I'm not saying it's wholly false, but like, you can go out into Detroit neighborhoods and you can say, no, you small business owner, you are part of the innovation economy. And then you can feel really good that you've got some real breadth and inclusivity in your innovation economy. And I think the better strategy is to think long-term and think way upstream and take clear aim at the education system and prepare students in Detroit schools to find a job in that very tight, narrowly defined innovation economy, research-driven, patentable technologies, et cetera, right? In that sector going forward. And the very good news is that this is a 15, 20-year strategy, but the very good news is that you will have invested in that economy, and so you will have that opportunity available to them. Whereas if you didn't invest in that sort of narrowly defined innovation economy, tech-driven economy, then you may not have that opportunity locally available to those students.
So staying on the theme of the innovation economy, we always hear one of the best examples being Pittsburgh. And I had the opportunity to hear the mayor of Pittsburgh talking last week at another conference, and he talked about the important role of Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh in helping to shift the economy of Pittsburgh away from steel and more toward really knowledge businesses. So my next question to the panel is, are there specific tools which are absolutely critical for our legacy cities to have and leverage in order to move toward this new world of creating knowledge workers and knowledge industries? And where do your cities stack up in that? Let's start with Milwaukee.
Well, because we're the ones that are different here. We had a strong university that was dealing with in the water area, but we had a stronger industry base. And so our cluster in new technology development has really been driven by the private sector. And I think it goes back to playing to your strengths and your roots. These were companies that, again, have a long decades of experience. They saw the demand for more talent and more research and more development that way. The university had started to go and grow, and they've just now sped that up quite a bit. I think when you look at Pittsburgh as an example, Carnegie Mellon has been there for a long, long period of time. The community has changed from a steel to more of an information technology, other areas as well. So it's evolved back to the strength of Carnegie Mellon.
I love the idea of the assets in the community. Every community has great, amazing assets. Henry Ford Health Systems, the research and the programmatic work they do. In Cleveland, the clinic and the other health institutions and the universities. So I totally agree with all that. I'm going to add another idea, which is alignment around expectations and results. And this is our experience in Northeast Ohio has been when the philanthropic, the civic, and the business leadership got together and identified what we were trying to accomplish, and then encouraged us to put together, real metrics tracking systems and alignment in our region to measure our work against that so that we could see if we were making progress. So much like a startup company has key milestones and you have to sort of pivot as you go and hit the key milestones, our system of intervention players has had to do the same thing, and I think that's been a really important tool.
I would add too that I think a lot of what we're talking about is cultural shifts. Boston has a particularly entrepreneurial and innovative cultural ecosystem that word's been used a lot today. And that frankly doesn't quite exist in the places where we're from. And I think there are exceptions to that, definitely. And different cities are sort of on different places in that spectrum. But making that cultural shift in the city requires local leadership. It requires a combination of public-private partnership leadership. And it frankly requires both kind of bottom up and top down change. So an example, just to get a little more concrete, Cincinnati has a neighborhood just outside the downtown. Many of you may have been there or heard of it, called Over the Rhine. And there's been tremendous investment in that particular neighborhood. It's an old historic German neighborhood. A lot of breweries were there. It was in severe decline still. If you look at the data, still high rate of vacancy, but much improved investment by all the corporate leaders. And there's a very well-known nonprofit developer leading the charge there called 3CDC. And they just, about a year ago, also decided to place sort of an equivalent of Jumpstart, an intermediary helping to drive fund and drive entrepreneurial change and companies, place it in that neighborhood. So I think a lot of this is about marrying that sort of neighborhood revitalization piece with changing the culture changing a culture to be more entrepreneurial. And that's really hard to do. I think Carlos said at the very beginning of this conference, there is no silver bullet. And that couldn't be more true in the kinds of cities and places where we are. So you have to be working sort of on multiple levels and addressing multiple, it's a multi-pronged approach on the battlefield, as it were. And it's, that's really the platform, I think, for moving all these places to the next level.
I would echo that placemaking, which I think is what you're describing, is sort of overlooked as
for capturing it in one good word.
One good buzzword, kind of like innovation. It is an essential act in sort of attracting and retaining human capital, knowledge workers, etc. And I think it's overlooked. I mean, it's capital intensive and it's difficult, but it's essential.
When I was doing consulting work in Cleveland many years ago, they used to say, well, at least we're not Detroit. And now that now that I live in Detroit, we don't want to have anything to do with Cleveland because we're the new Brooklyn. So can you talk about the length of time that it takes for cities to sort of reposition themselves, and how do you maintain enthusiasm and resources flowing for 10 years, 15 years to actually see the projects through? And what is the role of public policy in making sure that these things continue and that the new mayor or the new governor is not able to derail the good work that's been done for the past 10 years?
You just answered your question, right? 10 to 15 years is the time that it takes to.
Harder than I thought.
So I worked for .com on A Street here in 1999. So yeah, 10 to 15 years, right, to turn to a place really transform fundamentally. I actually think it is sort of about a generation, but I've been in Detroit for 6 years. That's like a very hard thing to talk about across generations. It's very, very hard for folks who've been at it for a while in Detroit to recognize that even at this warp speed of change, right, in the last few years that we've seen in Detroit, that we are still in a 25-year kind of game. But I really do think the fact of the matter, it has to do with cultural shift, attitude shifts, and things like that. It just takes a very long time, and it is about 15 to 25 years. For us, it hasn't been so much public policy. I think it's been just public sector leadership. I think some of that's frankly luck. Sometimes you get the right mayor, the right governor, or a confluence of both, or federal leadership. And we've been very fortunate, frankly, in the throes of bankruptcy, to have leadership on a lot of levels. In Detroit, really extraordinary leadership from the public sector, from the Obama administration's engagement with Detroit to the governor wading in. It was a very politically difficult thing for the governor to do. The leadership we got from our emergency financial manager, and then most recently from our elected mayor, Mayor Duggan, who's just worked hand in hand with our EFM. Things could have gotten very pear-shaped very quickly. And so we've had this extraordinary period of just very good leadership. And again, I don't know that it's good policy decisions as much as it's just really good public sector leadership.
I would agree with everything you just said. I would say too that we've seen even in the last 5 years an acceptance of making hard choices. And we have seen local leaders make some of those hard choices, meaning not being able to spread money like peanut butter to all their neighborhoods that are distressed, because it's just impossible under the fiscal circumstances and the number of neighborhoods that would need financial support. So making hard choices based on good data, what neighborhoods can be stabilized, what maybe aren't quite at the level of being able to be stabilized, but once this neighborhood is stabilized, go to the next one. I have to hand it to some of our local leaders. I would agree with Bruce Katz. A lot of the innovation and the hard decisions are starting to be made on the local level, not all of them. I'd say on the state policy piece that, at least in Ohio, and I guess I should speak more from Ohio's perspective, we've seen some acknowledgement that the investment in these different cities needs to be made based on promoting or supporting certain kinds of industries, building on assets, and supporting certain institutions that are going to be the anchors of revitalization. That's certainly happening. But I'd say that we're a little disappointed in not seeing as much strategic business economic investment and still a lot of the traditional investment in our traditional, I guess we call it ambulance chasing. Just can we get any company to come to Ohio, no matter if it locates in a city or in a green field, on a brownfield in a city or in a green field. So we'd like to see still, I think, states, at least Ohio, and I think it's true in other places as well, be a little more strategic with their investments. I think the third piece is there's a huge infrastructure piece that's not been addressed. I would agree with Ed Glazer that we can't spend billions of dollars on transit in each of the 3 major cities in Ohio, or even the second-tier cities. But if there were better bus rapid transit, that would attract more millennials. If we could upgrade our sewer and water infrastructure, all of our cities are under consent orders to improve their sewer and water. I mean, these are things that some of them lie below the surface, but again, have to be addressed if we're going to upgrade our cities to be able to sustain this kind of innovation and ecosystem, which is much further down the continuum. But these are all pieces that need to be put into place.
The biggest challenge we have instead of like Detroit is that people think we're Minneapolis, and they think you're way up there. Well, actually, no, we're not. We're closer to Chicago than anything. The question of the mayor and the governor, this goes back to that private-public partnership, at least with what we have been doing. It has been private sector driven. I don't necessarily worry about changes within the political offices. They help us when they need to, but they also don't get in our way from a private sector to be able to drive faster. Now, we come from a place that we have a governor who is absolutely opposite from the mayor of Milwaukee. They have run 2 elections against each other. They do not sit well together. But interesting enough, when it comes to working within our water sector, they are absolutely united, and we can go to them and they will show up on the same stage, sit right next to each other, and speak the same language that we ask them to speak, which is interesting enough. The same thing happens within Washington, D.C. We have one of the more liberal senators and one of the more conservative senators. And both of them are totally supportive of what we're trying to do. So as a cluster, we do not rely upon the political whims because they're going to change. You know, in a few years, we're going to have a different mayor, possibly a different governor. You know, we've got an election going on right now that could change. But the cluster is not going to change. It's going to keep on growing because it's been private sector driven.
Cleveland is Cleveland. We don't compare ourselves to anybody. So I think just a couple of things to add. One is we stick to results in terms of political changes. We've weathered several of them and just try to keep to the facts. What has happened, what has changed, what has been the benefit that the state in partnership with philanthropy and others have created. In terms of the length of time, I agree with Benji. I think it's generational. I think we've learned to believe that, but celebrating the small successes has been important, as has been taking a look in a really strategic, serious way every 5 to 10 years to say, how do we need to change? It's, you know, that's hard, is we fall in love with the programs we're doing and the impact we're creating. Maybe that's not the need moves. And so really being serious about reevaluating the needs so that the work is different and addresses the new challenges over time, that's been important.
I just want to add, because maybe Benji's too modest to do so, that this generational change, philanthropy is a huge piece of making sure that local leadership, local businesses keep their eye on the ball and understand that this is really long-term. I know in Ohio we could not be doing any of this without philanthropy, and I'm sure that's true. I know that's true in Detroit, but if the philanthropic sector has the ability and the power really to look longer term and to hold public sector and even private sector's feet to the fire to ensure that we keep looking down the road.
I think that one of the things that's critical for, let's put it this way, Innovation City, is to be diverse in their industry base. If anything, if you look at Detroit, reliance upon one industry was the problem with it. And what we're trying to do within Milwaukee is create multiple industries. We are a nonprofit organization. I don't want to rely upon 3 funding sources. I want to have 25 to 30 different streams of money coming through, because if I get, lose one, it hurts, but it's not as bad as, losing 1 out of 3. And I think for a city, now within Milwaukee, water is certainly important, but we're not the largest at all. There are industries that are much larger. Energy, food and beverage, all of those other things. And so rather than having one industry be curing cancer for a city, you have to have multiple industries, and then again, playing to those strengths.
Yes, I would agree with what both of you said. When during the last economic downturn in Detroit, industry was completely decimated, and what was left really was philanthropy, but also the eds and the meds. And that also speaks to how cities need to really leverage what they have in the way of universities and hospitals in their communities and use them as economic generators, because you never know what industry will be there 20 years from now, either through economic downturn or just because they're gone and something else has taken over and they're now in Portland, Oregon. Right. So before we turn this over to a broader conversation with the audience, I would like to ask each of the panelists to talk about the one biggest change that you've seen in your city in the past 5 years, 10 years, pick a time frame. What is the one change that's driving us toward this innovation economy?
I'm going to break the rule and say 2. I'm going to give 2 examples. Well, I like to represent entrepreneurs, the rule breakers. So the first is really specific. It's about venture capital and investment in startups. We had very, very little, and now we have a lot more. We still need more, but where we need it and the type of investment we need has changed. We needed it in the very, very early stages, 8 to 10 years ago, to start companies and get them going. Now we need it in the later stages. So the need has shifted pretty dramatically. Meanwhile, we've had companies that have generated over 1.4 billion in investment capital. So we've had tremendous economic impact and tremendous job growth, among other outcomes that have come from the work that's happened in the last 10 years. So that's one. The second, though, which I think is also very exciting, is our self, our culture, our city, our pride, and our region. And it gets to that, sort of funny comment we were just talking about. When I moved to Cleveland 10 years ago, and I was also a boomeranger, literally my neighbors would say, "Why did you move here from Atlanta?" And I found that so curious. Nobody ever asked me that when I moved anywhere else. Nobody will ask that today. I mean, people are proud of Cleveland. They're proud of the transformation in our region, and they want to stay there, and they can see futures for their families there. And to me, that's what this game ultimately is all about.
Actually, I was going to sort of say the same thing. It's new ideas by new people, and that can be some people who are coming back. I'm a boomerang from Milwaukee. And you go and you experience some other place, and you come back and go, "Oh my word, wow, we didn't see this and experience this." And then you get new people who are moving in as well. I mean, the biggest sea change, and my job is also, there's lots of puns with water. So the biggest sea change that we've seen is the fact that there is a whole new attitude. And that can do so many different things. Where, if anything that I see from coming out of Detroit is there is an attitude change, and that can do so much wonderful things, and we've experienced that as well.
I don't work directly with entrepreneurs, but I would say that the major change in the last couple years is just the idea that urban density is a good thing, and cities are back to being a cool place to live. And I think, if anything, legacy cities have not capitalized on that or leveraged that sufficiently, and I think that's something that's right front and center that we need to be working on. And actually, I wanted to make one other point, if that's okay, not directly in response to your question, but one thing I hope maybe we'll talk about when we open this up is the legacy cities are sort of an inverted Boston region, have an inverted Boston region relationship, meaning that all of our cities emptied out in the last 30 to 40 years population-wise. Most of the population went to the suburbs, some went, other parts of the country. And that city-region relationship is one that has to get fixed in these legacy cities, because the cities aren't necessarily yet viewed as the drivers of economic growth. It could be pockets in the suburbs. And I hope, we don't have the answer to that, but I'd love to hear more about, sort of ideas on where to go with that next in our regions, where the cities might be starting to repopulate, but that it's going to be a while until they really are the centers of economic growth. And I think Boston is the center of its region and is the center of growth, but that's something I think that's a real distinguishing feature here.
6 years ago we were talking about a light rail line, and now we're building one. I don't care what Ed Glazer says. We like our light rail line. We're thrilled to be building it, and that is actually a huge thing. It's a huge change. I agree with everything. Frankly, we've experienced the same thing: attitude shifts, cultural shifts, the attitude of the region to as they look at the city, wanting to engage the city more. The sort of activity, feet on the street downtown. It's amazing how much our city has transformed, and also extraordinary how much we still have to do. But the light rail under construction is a big deal for the last metropolitan area in the country not to have a major metropolitan area, not to have a fixed rail regional system.
Well, thank you, everybody, and let's have some audience questions.
A comment and a question. Words have meaning, and I would agree with Benji that innovation is not everything. It can't be everything for everything for all people, or else everything means everything, and then everything doesn't mean everything. So I think that defining innovation and what it means going forward as far as a contributor to social change and impact in urban areas is very important. Now, the second part of that is it distresses me that our major issue is what you identified, which is education. Because what fuels innovation is education. Smart people, people that can think outside the box, people that are challenged to think outside the box. And what distresses me is that over my lifetime I've seen now many cycles, and those cycles always end up that when there's a downturn, the first thing to get cut is education. So there is a huge public policy issue here, and a huge private sort of sector problem that we have in this country in undervaluing the essence of what it is that will put us on top and keep us on top in a global economy that's being driven by innovation. So I lament that. I deal with that on a local level because of our systemic issues in St. Louis, and other legacy cities have the same thing. And I don't, I've gotten very pessimistic about seeing anything long-term change when it comes to really investing in education to get a return over a generation, because it is a generational issue.
So let me just say, first, I'm glad like one person in the room agrees with me on the innovation definition. But and also I want to just say something. Innovation is not the only thing that's special. I'm not suggesting that retail business isn't hugely accretive to what we're trying to do in Detroit. It's very important. Just call it what it is. The education issue is humongous. I mean, it is right, the elephant in the room. I guess part of me is a pragmatist. And so, what I've taken aim at, I think what we've taken aim at with the Kresge Foundation in Detroit is not K-12 reform. We've started with the things that we think we can really make real change on, in a discrete sort of period of time, 5-10 years. It's waiting for us. We have this saying, like 3 small kids, we have this saying, like, eat the frog, which is basically you have to start with go on and do the hard thing, right? So I tell my kids, got homework to do, eat the frog, just do it now. Got to practice piano, just do it now, eat the frog, then you can do the other things. And I think at some point we're going to have to eat the elephant in the room, right? I mean, we're going to have to address this education issue. And I would sort of agree with you that, that time is coming soon as we see this growing disparity across the country, and in particular, growing rapidly in our urban areas. The time is coming, and we're all going to have to suck it up and face this thing. And it's going to divert, frankly, a lot of resources from a lot of very good work in other areas, but it is unavoidable.
I just wanted to bring back in a theme from yesterday that Sandy Pentland mentioned in the opening panel, which is the larger historic perspective. So when we talk about innovation economy, sometimes I feel like we're using it as a shorthand for our excitement over the fact that we're living in this new kind of renaissance, right? Not since then have we been in a fundamental rewiring of how we make money, how we make meaning, how we spread information, how we share ideas, how we collaborate as a society. So this is a really, really, really exciting time. And we use the word innovation because we're sort of realizing that we're in a really new space and in a really new environment. And innovation is a great word to talk about something new, but it's a lot more than innovation, right? This is really a new sort of societal model that we're moving into. So innovation isn't about creating new stuff. It's not about necessarily tech creation. This about this renaissance that we're in, or this new period, is really about moving into a world, as Sandy was describing yesterday, in which everyone can be a change agent. Everyone can participate thanks to technology. Everyone can know, everyone can care, everyone can see, and so everyone can create. And if that's the situation we're in, then creating an innovation economy in a city is about preparing our kids and our citizens for being a player, for being a part of a society in which everyone can be an agent of change, in which everyone sees that, oh my gosh, if there's a pothole, sure, I can email it to the city of Boston, but I also can think of a way to, fix things. If I see someone with a problem, I can be a problem solver. So that's sort of the seismic shift that we're in. And so when we think about creating an innovation, atmosphere in a city, I'm just encouraging us to think about, or I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we move away from thinking about it as sort of a niche of the economy to being sort of moving society into what fundamentally is a new paradigm that has effects on how we think about how kids grow up. Whether kids grow up to be members of an industrial economy, where they are prepared to do rote learning and spit out facts, or whether they are collaborative problem solvers, whether they develop entrepreneurship, whether they have empathy, whether they care, and whether they see themselves as people who have a right to play.
A little crack. That's a great question. It's a really important question. So there's no way I'm not really an expert in answering that question. I just know my little piece of the world. But one thing that I think that is so powerful is storytelling. And I think the idea of telling stories of all different kinds, and I think that's part of what you're saying, is let's define things more broadly. So let's tell a lot of different kinds of stories that will change the culture in the many different ways that you're talking about. And a huge part of the work that we do is gathering stories and asking for approval to tell stories. And that's why conferences like this are fantastic, because it gives all of us the opportunity to hear about and talk about other people's stories. And I'd love to talk about some stories after this.
You ever go to the next question? Good.
I'm surprised that none of you mentioned an arts community, because everywhere that I've lived, particularly in legacy cities that have reinvented themselves and branded themselves virtually, has been started by artists. I mean, you wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for artists that moved into Fort Point Channel. So there's a creative economy that I think you have to bring into that. The other thing I wanted to say is that if a retailer is selling online because they don't have the foot traffic to do business in a traditional way, they're part of the innovation network, aren't they? So I don't think you can, I think doing anything differently, all right, as a result of need, all right, is innovation. And in fact, I think you need a downturn of some kind. Maybe not as complete as happened in Detroit, but Soho is Soho because the fur district, the fur business moved, all right, out of New York. So I think you need both good and bad, but you definitely not need artists.
Well, here's a little dirty secret. I actually used to work in theater, and that was I don't have a water background. I don't know squat about any of this stuff. In engineering, it gets too technical. Talk to Glenn. He's the person. So I started out in theater, and so I come with that as an approach and attitude, and ran arts organizations. What we're actually doing as we create our water tech sector, we actually are seeking more of those design aspects of things. And we play off of a company that, Kohler company, makes toilets. But they have some of the most remarkable arts and cultural programs that are there, where they bring artists actually working in the factories on the design of new installations, using pottery, using metal, all of those kind of things. And so we see it actually as a great integration. And fortunately, we have a board of directors and CEOs who see the value of design in product development as well. So we're very much interested, and we want more of that closer to us because there is a feeding off of that, of each other.
I just would affirm what you said, that I think it didn't come up just.
Because Lisa didn't ask a question. So it's your fault.
But absolutely, I mean, I think as we all know, most of these distressed neighborhoods are stabilized by artists to begin with, and then it goes from there. What's that?
Then we push them out.
Well, that's another story, but yeah, absolutely.
That's an important point, because I think sometimes I mean, there's this sort of tension between artists and arts for art's sake, and, you know, artists as sort of producers or value creators too, right? So the creative economy. And at Kresge, we actually sort of believe in both, right? I mean, we do like the idea that the arts is a powerful economic driver, potentially. It's an attractor, it can attract investment, capital, etc. But one also has to just recognize what artists bring to quality of life, quality of place, and to community, and what they give to us. And so, in fact, at Kresge, we sort of have grant programs that support both. We do a lot of creative placemaking. We are looking for this strategic role that the creative sector has to play in economic revitalization, and we're supporting it all across the country. But we also have a Kresge Artist Fellows program that is simply giving checks to artists to continue practicing their work in Detroit. And because we love to have them around, we love that aspect of our community, and we want to make sure that it exists for a very, very long time.
Yeah, I just want to add that I wouldn't know that your city was downturned unless I saw some kind of artist involved. I mean, I didn't understand the extent of Detroit's problems until there was an article about artists coming in and being able to take these huge spaces and redo them in some way. So I think it's really so primal to us as communal beings. So always mention it.
This was a question about capital. My name is Bill and I work for the Mass Tech Innovation Institute. We're an economic development agency in Massachusetts, based in Westboro. As a context for the question, I'd say that in Massachusetts, leaders have come to the conclusion in the last couple of years of really a tale of two states. There's sort of the Boston, Cambridge sort of axis, and then there's the rest of the state largely. And that relates to this notion that many of you espouse that we need change is generational. The capital that you're using to cause change is very patient. It's not focused on short-term horizons, and you may feel enormous pressure to prove things over quarter to quarter, year to year, but really you're trying to change cultures and conditions over a period of time. The amount of money that's come into your areas, either because of philanthropy or the Obama administration or something like that, is profound. Whether it's privates in Pittsburgh, which is always held up as the quintessential example of regrowth. I think there's hundreds of small cities that would love to follow your examples. And I wonder where the capital is going to, the patient capital is going to come from, that's going to see those cities over a course of 2, 3, 4 mayors, or 2, 3, or 4 governors. And I wonder, based on your background, where you imagine the capital would come from for those hundreds of small cities in the nation that don't enjoy what Boston has, or the philanthropy that Pittsburgh has, and so forth.
So I can jump in on that. I guess first I would say that this generational change is certainly about capital flowing in. It's all the reason, though, that it's also such a long-term horizon is that you're fixing so many systems that need to be fixed. It's not just business growth, but it's sort of the other infrastructure things that I mentioned. So many of them have been underinvested in for so long. So, I mean, it is about capital flow, but it's about fixing a lot of different kinds of systems. But we actually in Ohio think a lot about those other cities, because Ohio happens to have a number, it's a multiple node state. And I don't have the answer to that, but I will say that this idea of regional growth is extremely important. Because what I think is we're seeing starting to happen, what I think is going to happen more, is that these places are going to be dominated by one major city, and the rest of these sort of small and medium-sized cities are going to be part of those ambits. And essentially that's what we're starting to see. And even if we're not seeing it, I think we need to be, if it's all possible, driving that with public policy. And that is partly happening. Ohio, for instance, its economic growth at the state level there's a new entity, it's called Jobs Ohio. It's actually very controversial for a variety of reasons, but at least it's taking a regional approach to job growth. New York City, Governor Cuomo also instituted a regional approach to economic development, particularly in upstate New York. And to me, that is the only way we're going to deal with the multiple cities that have been in decline for so long.
Many cities, though certainly not all, have colleges, universities, hospitals, which all have endowments. And the endowments typically have they have investments which can be made, patient investment in the surrounding community that has paid back, but it's non-traditional, and there could be a long-term perspective on that. This is something that many universities have looked at, but very few have actually done, and I think it's time for them to step up and really invest in their surrounding communities, put their money where their mouth is. And that would open up a tremendous source of capital for many, many communities that otherwise couldn't tap into it.
Let me add, private sector needs to invest back into the communities as well, because they're the ones that are going to be creating the jobs out of there. The public sector, mayors do not create jobs, businesses create the jobs, and you really have to get specific business leaders to be investing back into that city.
Hi, very interesting conversation. My question relates to some extent to yours. I generally agree with the side of the panel that sees innovation in a broad sense. But looking at innovation strictly in terms of high tech, is there any discussion that is taking place in these cities about the difference between big science breakthrough Silicon Valley style innovation and process and production-based innovation? And I ask this because the latter type of innovation is related to production and manufacturing, much of which we have offshored. And these are the cities that built America. This is, America's, traditional manufacturing centers, especially these smaller, what we call gateway cities, legacy cities. And I'm just wondering if there's been any talk among any of these entities in these cities about preparing for the possible reshoring of manufacturing and how that might play out in terms of the way you think about innovation. Because one thought that I've had, and I've talked with others about it, is that Boston is a great center of, breakthrough innovation, but these smaller cities, what we call gateway cities, could be revitalized as manufacturing centers in concert with what's going on in Boston.
I'll just take a quick shot at that. That conversation is definitely going on in Ohio. It's called, some people call it advanced manufacturing. I always kind of wonder what that really means. But I mean, what I think we take it to mean is it's the innovative side of manufacturing. It definitely doesn't employ the numbers of people that it used to. But we are seeing that reshoring, definitely in Ohio, of advanced manufacturing coming back to the state. And I think you're right that it is possible that it could be put in place, or will be put in places that are maybe not the major cities, but still have the the physical places for that kind of manufacturing. I think you're right about that.
And the capital to labor ratios don't look like old manufacturing, and I think that's what I mean. It's important to be very clear about what we're talking about, because I've been in Detroit, and we were having exactly that conversation, and advanced manufacturing is very excited. Real advanced manufacturing. It's very exciting, and it is innovative, and it is actually technology driven, and but but it's not going to be what manufacturing was. And so when people hear manufacturing in Detroit, they think, oh, jobs for everyone. And it's simply not going to be that, especially with the erosion of our skilled worker base in certain pockets of our region. So I think we have to be very, very careful, and it's a very challenging conversation about how you define that and who it's really going to benefit, etc.
And that's something that we're thinking about a lot, is this notion of long-term investments. It's not going to be invest in a company and you're going to get a huge, quick return in 1 year. This is a big play. And think about China a lot necessarily, and companies are moving out of China to come back for lots of different reasons, but the Chinese have a 5-year model. Every 5 years, there's a new plan, and they try to fit into that. The things that we can't fit into a 5-year plan, and frankly they shouldn't either, because it's not sustainable for them in the long term. But to be able to get some of the investment community to realize you have to go along.
Thank you. Hi everyone, thanks for being here. So if you know me, you know that 35% of Boston's population is 20 to 34, so kind of that millennial generation. And the reason why you know that is because my job for the city of Boston is basically to think about ways in which we can continue to grow that population here in Boston, because we strongly believe that that's kind of led to our economic vitality as well as our social vitality. Others. I was just curious if any of you guys institutionally or through your public sector are thinking about ways in which you can grow that population as part of economic stimulus.
Yeah, we're going to borrow some of your millennials.
I
When I borrow, I can steal. I mean, this is, of course, it's kind of a heavy conversation, right? Because there's implications there. Like if you start talking about attracting millennials, etc., it has people read certain things into it in Detroit, and there's a sort of equity conversation, social equity conversation baked into that. But if I think virtually anyone in Detroit will recognize it. If you are losing population and you want to turn the tide, like you are going to need to attract and retain millennials. So then the question is, how in the world do you do that? Because what we don't have that Boston and New York and Chicago and Los Angeles, San Francisco have is that steady churn, right? You've got big employers, and they're bringing in millennials and they're pushing out millennials, and the millennials everywhere. So what we've so you try to do a couple of things, and I think it goes to the placemaking, to the creative placemaking, to you want to make sure that you have the right sort of quality of place, quality of life that makes the place a sort of interesting proposition to millennials. I think the second thing that we've tried to do, and the one thing I've learned is millennials attract more millennials, right? So you want to sort of broadcast, right, that you are a place where millennials are going, and so some of that is the sort of narrative, the storytelling, and we try to do a lot of that, and the New York Times helps us out tremendously in Detroit because they've really pushed that narrative. And then the third thing we've tried to do is it's not just about any old millennials. I mean, actually, I think that demographic plays a really important kind of implementer role when you're talking about these big, complicated economic revitalization strategies, right? Because what you get in legacy cities are a lot of really committed, really smart leaders who were implementing like 20 years ago, and just professionally, they're past all the implementing. They're going to be up here visioning, right? And someone else is going to do the implementing. And then they turn around and like, oh, remember we had that whole like city district plan, now we're going to revitalize it. But who's doing that? Who's working on it? It's all little projects, right? You got to go out and raise capital and get this block done or that parcel done or that streetscape done. And there's no one to do that. No one in city government. There's no one in the nonprofit sector in particular, right? We need those implementers. So we started a program called the Detroit Revitalization Fellows Program, specifically to try to go out and essentially aggregate hiring in our public sector and our nonprofit sector so that we could, every couple of years, pull in 30, 40 millennials, young implementers, people with project management skills, people who had worked in city government in Boston or New York City or something like that, and sort of hire under the banner of Detroit's Revitalization Incorporated, right? And then they come in and we place them at, a nonprofit community development corporation, or we place them in the city, and they build this fantastic network. And now there are like 3 or 4 other efforts like that. There's Venture for America, which is doing that in a number of different cities in the tech sort of entrepreneurship space. There's Challenge Detroit, which is very similar and sort of straddles nonprofit and for-profit. There's Teach for America, which is like an old model of that. And if you actually start to aggregate that, and you get a nice, visible, and sort of loud millennial constituency, and then you can build the narrative from there. So there's very practical ways to make that happen.
And I'll just say, first to affirm your proposition, absolutely, it's a core of revitalization of these places. I caught the report last year where we looked at a number of legacy cities, and the 4 that were improving shared the fact that they'd all increased the number of millennials that live there. But the one cautionary note I think that we also saw in that study is, it goes back to your observation, that the question is, will they stay? And not necessarily stay in the region, but in the city itself. And the key to them staying is the education, is the availability of schools as they marry, as have kids, maybe not married, but have, and that's a real danger right now. I think some of these cities are attracting millennials, but will they stay? And what do we need to do to have them stay? I think that's a huge lurking question out there.
I just want to add one more thing on that. So yes, we're all thinking about it actively. The one thing to add is in a legacy city, a millennial has a huge leadership opportunity, both on the implementation side, but also on the sort of civic involvement and leadership side. We're so eager to have these young people in our towns, and anybody can get a meeting with anybody who, with enough initiative, a young person can really make a name for themselves very, very quickly. I think in Cleveland and Akron and other places I work in, probably lots of legacy cities, and what an exciting opportunity that is.
We'll do the 2:45, so another 10 minutes or so, plenty of time. Bill, you're up next.
Thank you. Bill Gormley with Economy. This has been an outstanding panel, just great stuff. One of the things that I want to do is combine a couple things, and I'm kind of throwing bait at Dean and Cathy to start, because you talked about storytelling, Cathy, and Dean, you talked about theatrics in a broader sense. One of the things that over in Kendall Square and on the Freedom Trail and in what we call Menino's Id, which is this area here, the thing that we've felt a deep need for is interpretation, i.e. ambassadors, people to lead people on tours through. And is Travis McCready here yet?
He was.
When you see him later, he's one of the great tour leaders of all time. If you can get a Travis tour, do it. But what we found is there are 2 groups who do this really, really well. Actors and actresses who really can take a script and do Harvard Square for you and take you on the ghost tour of Harvard Square, or the, even more important to us in Kendall Square, the techno, the origins of technology in Kendall Square. And here's where radar was invented on the left, and here's where Akamai is running the National Operations Center on the right, et cetera, et cetera. And I just was intrigued that I'm suddenly sitting here realizing I don't know in Cincinnati, in Akron, in Dayton, in the various cities in Cleveland, I don't know if you have interpretation trails and or museums that are the city history museums where you can look back to look forward and stimulate that conversation. Because one of the things we do with these ambassadors, just to bait you one step further, is we have them take suggestions for new ideas for Kendall Square's public art. What should be there? What should we be doing to make Kendall Square more attractive, more organic, more interesting than just glass and steel structures? And so, back to the point though, have you done this in Milwaukee or in Cleveland or in Detroit or wherever in a new and interesting way that we could learn from?
We actually have, in 2 weeks, we will have an in-house historian through the state of Wisconsin. Wisconsin Historical Society has designated us as a living historical event. And I don't know, that makes us like feel really old. We've only been around for like 4 or 5 years. But they're saying, they're looking forward 50 years is that this is a point in time where there is change that is happening. And they see us at a center of that. And so they will have in-house somebody who will be documenting every single thing that we're doing. We also do lots of different tours to the point now, in-house, we're having to get a lot of young people to do the tours for us because we just can't keep on doing that all the time. And there is a historian that helps tell our story and write about it, and he's got a film that he's working on to help tell that story. The other storytellers are the media, and that was one of the things that's been most helpful for us. It started locally and now is going global, and so let's put it this way, Exconomy, we're actually one of your sponsors too. And because you help tell our story, we are in fact having you in as one of our receptions in our building. And you help tell our story as well. We've got a call now coming from the BBC who says, hey, listen, I'd like to do a story about what you guys are doing. Not about us necessarily, but about the solutions that we are providing to help people. One of the most important things that we had as a storyteller, Delta Sky magazine. I can't believe this. We've been in these things before, but it wasn't about us. It was about us commenting about water. And I got phone calls from around the country saying, I want to know some more things as well.
We're a hub, so we got Delta Sky magazine as a storyteller too. They do articles on us all the time.
But it's not. But my point is, it's not about talking about Detroit. It's about talking about what you may be doing in Detroit.
Yeah, it was a good. It's a good outlet. And I'll tell you one thing. It's the Midwest, and people are nice. So like everyone's an ambassador. You need to name ambassadors in Boston. I grew up there. I pay attention for 3 hours. But I think what we're challenged with in Detroit is, there's tours, and that's great. And there's a lot of history in these cities. There's a lot of good stories. There's a lot of good historic tours. The architecture is extraordinary. You can learn a lot of things. But for our purposes, what's challenging is this sort of very intentional tour where you've got someone, and we're getting a lot of this in Detroit, you've got someone who's interested and they have a very specific thing they want to do. They want to deploy capital or they want to help out in some sector. You need to find the right person to take them around and for a couple hours show them some real investable propositions. And that's a little bit more challenging. We're working on that. I like the district steward model is what I call it. It's the sort of nonprofit leader that really is advocating for a specific, say, geography in the city or specific slice of the work. But it's a stewardship kind of mentality. You feel like the caretaker and you want to make sure that anyone who's coming to sort of understand your space gets that, really good tour, that really good sort of personal touch, high touch, and you help them find a way to land and connect.
Travis, come on, stand up. Come on. You're from St. Louis, you can stand up.
From California originally. But, so one of the things that hasn't been discussed yet is the role of failure. And failure as a driver. The arts community is really comfortable with the idea of failure. However, we don't see galleries with images of failure. We see galleries that have a finished product. And sometimes our initiatives for our legacy cities also want to wait until things are polished and finished before we decide to put them on display or before the New York Times covers them. Can you talk a little bit about the role of failure and how failure can actually aid in storytelling and actually aid in encouraging millennials, because there is that level of transparency, that level of humility, and that level of, yes, we know it's going to take a generation to get these changes in place, but we're going to have a series of failures along the way that will get us to the end result.
So obviously in entrepreneurship, failure is a huge thing. And what we have found in a culturally transitioning city like we're in is that the way we can start with talking about failure in a way that actually works is when somebody has been successful after that failure and they're able to reflect on it and talk about the lessons learned. Yeah. So we're not quite at the point yet where we can say, oh my gosh, I had this failure right now and let me tell you about it. We're not really there. But We have been able, in fact, some of our media outlets have specific stories regularly, like weekly, about failures, what I learned from that failure 2 years ago or 3 years ago that I've been able to capitalize on. And I think that's probably something that will evolve over time. We might be able to be more explicit about that, but that's working so far.
I would just say from a more 10,000-foot level that about 3 years ago, Forbes had a piece where they named the 10, I think it was worst cities, and I forget how they were evaluating them. I think 6 of them were in Ohio. That caused that people really bristled. About 6 months later, there was a meeting, a conference about it in Dayton, and I think there is a sort of a feeling of, you can coalesce together around these, feeling on the downside of things. But I also think what we've seen in Ohio as a result of the downturn of every city really except Columbus, there's less fragmentation in the state. Each of these cities in Ohio used to compete with each other. They really don't so much anymore, out of necessity. So, you do start to, that's probably not quite the kind of failure we're thinking of, but it plays on a lot of different levels, I guess is what I'm saying.
Let me just take a slightly different angle on it. So, I get it, it's nice to celebrate failure when you're in Silicon Valley, your third successful startup. Oh, we had this failure once. It's fun, let's think about that. But look, in 2009 I arrived in Detroit, automotive's in crisis, 2 in bankruptcy, city sliding into financial crisis, the football team was 0-16. Seriously, you actually don't want to celebrate failure. We don't want to fail. We don't like to feel like failures. We're very proud in our city. So, the only way that sort of, to me, failure plays in is that it's the stakes are very different. Because it's the crisis, right? It's someone pointed out, it's the crisis that actually changes the stakes. It changes kind of the risk equation. It allows people to take great risks, but not because we decide we'll celebrate failure. It's okay if you fail. It's just that the sort of risk environment is completely changed. We're working on a different spectrum.
Yeah.
Building on that, there's also a very generational outlook to failure in Detroit. We've had 30 years of failure playing out on the front page of the newspaper, and people who have moved to the suburbs and who now have children, they remember the Detroit of the past. They don't know the Detroit of today. So even the slightest failure leads the person who lives in Royal Oak or Birmingham or wherever to say, well, of course, what else do we expect from Detroit? So therefore, failure, again, is whereas a younger person or somebody working in Detroit would say, okay, let's just do it differently next time, you almost go backwards 20 years because the perception of the older generation is still that Detroit is a place where, of course, you're going to have failure. What else do we expect?
Okay, that's a wrap for this time.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.